We had the discussion with my old friend Mohammed the other day for a couple hours, and he asked me a sort of simple and fundamental question about the history of centralization. And for most of our history as human beings on planet Earth, that comes down to questions of empire, questions of nationality, local self-government, nation states, as opposed to larger empires bringing together many different peoples with many different languages. And now in the 21st century, we deal with many of the same issues and questions, but using very different jargon. Now, why did he put this question to me? It's because he knows I'm a very unusual person for any white English-speaking person in politics today. I mean, this is not just unusual for the left, for the center, or for the right. It is unusual anywhere on the white Western English-speaking spectrum to openly say that the balance of powers doctrine in European history was a mistake, that this was a profound fundamental mistake. So what do I mean? I mean that, just to give an example, if you look at the period when Napoleon was ruling Europe, like let's say you're going to study that in a university course, so you'll probably look at the 50 years of history before Napoleon, and you'll maybe briefly look at the 50 years after. What you'll find again and again and again is this idea that what is best for Europe is for Europe to be divided between several equal, mutually antagonistic great powers, to have at all times a kind of internecine war, and the parties negotiating these bizarre agreements and pacts, they don't really care too much if it's the French against the Spanish, or if it's the French and the Spanish on the same side against everyone else, but that one way or another, the sports team have to be drawn up. You know, there are the Russians and there are the Dutch, and so that there are various empires constantly at war with one another, that centralization is bad, that too much power in any one place is bad. Now, I think that this philosophy really began with the rule of Emperor Charles V. I think that was the period. It's a very deep medieval assumption, basically since people gave up on the concept of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, you could say, was one kind of delusion of centralization, of one empire ruling all of Europe. How you define Europe changes from century to century. And then when people give up on that idea of Rome, whether it's the first Rome or the second Rome or the third Rome, then they go over to this idea that what's best for Europe is to be constantly divided internally. And very briefly, you guys may or may not know this, but if you were to look at the history of the Caribbean, if you were even to look at the history of the islands of Southeast Asia, so like Indonesia and beyond, into Samoa and so on, Europeans exported this assumption with the best way to organize life in the Caribbean is to have the Caribbean divided between various mutually hostile, antagonistic European empires that are in a constant state of war against one another, which includes piracy and slave trading and all these things. Oh, you know what the best thing is going to be for the people of Samoa is if the Dutch and the Germans and the British and the French are all there competing, if everyone has a piece of it, so on for South America, that this is what is best for mankind. And to be clear, we're not talking about free market competition. We're not talking about the idea that in economics, it's better for you if you have your choice between Coke and Pepsi and Fanta, that there are several different choices for economic competition. This is explicitly military competition. This is competition between empires. So Muhammad knows this about me, that I say, when you look at the history of China, one of the great advantages that they have is that they were not burdened by this delusion that internally dividing themselves and being in a constant state of civil war, so to speak, that wasn't advantageous. That what was really advantageous was having one emperor, one system of exams, and then a system of education that's attached to those exams, one bureaucracy, and yes, whenever possible, one army for a huge area that had many different spoken languages, less diversity in written languages, but that's another story. And you really can look at China as being a world unto itself in the same way that when you look at all of Europe or all of the Roman Empire, it's not one country, it's a world unto itself, but where there's the idea of centralized political leadership in this case. So, with all this having said about context, what is basically my view about centralization and decentralization now in the 21st century? This is what I was challenged on or asked about by my friend Mohammed. And I think my view is so simple, it can be kind of stated in one sentence. I think what human beings yearn for and require is a system of local decision-making, but centralized enforcement. What do I mean by this? I think people want to meet at their local city hall to decide where the roads will be built and which buildings will be bulldozed to build the roads. They may also want to meet at their local city hall to debate what the speed limit will be on the road. However, they don't want to hire a local sign painter to paint the speed limit sign by hand. They don't particularly need local workmen to actually build the road or do the demolition. Most fundamentally, they probably don't want local guys with local family connections collecting taxes. They would benefit from having a highly professional, centralized, impersonal bureaucracy that collects the taxes. The sign that says speed limit 80, whatever the speed limit is, that might be painted at a centralized factory, at a centralized workshop or warehouse and sent to them. They voted on what the speed limit is, but they didn't make the sign. It may be made to standard specifications so that all the speed limit signs look the same throughout a huge country or huge empire, so that all the stop signs look the same. That stuff shouldn't be decentralized, shouldn't be localized. And again, sorry, I'm not even saying shouldn't. It need not be. That's not what people yearn for. That's not what people want in democracy. I don't think there's any legitimacy in saying, well, we have our own local democracy. We make stop signs our way. We make speed limit signs our way. Or even we pave the roads our way. I think that local democracy, you want to be engaging in deliberation at the level of local democracy. You want to be engaging in debate at the level of local democracy. But when it comes to execution, implementation, and enforcement, those are things that have to be centralized. Now, the only other riddle here, this is almost everything I have to say on top, but the one footnote is I think that people do not think often enough about government in terms of research. Research also must be partly centralized. So let's say you have a local government, local city council like this, and they say, well, we think the river is polluted. We're getting some, but we don't really know. So again, they can debate it, they can discuss it, they can vote on it, but they need to be able to take a water sample and probably send it to a laboratory that's run by the centralized government. It's not going to be possible for every little local city authority to have its own lab staff and to be able to scrutinize and hire, look at someone's CV and say, okay, are you really competent to do these tests on the water? And are we going to trust you? Are we going to trust this guy? They probably need to have access to some kind of, again, kind of independent, centralized, empire-wide, kingdom-wide, nation-wide laboratory that's going to receive that water sample and give them a standardized test and give them a result, and that will be able to tell them in a scientifically verifiable and valid way, yes, it's polluted, no, it's not polluted, here are the contents of the water. And, even kind of historical research, even checking records for who owns what property or what happened historically. There was a town in Canada, it's not worth mentioning why I did this research, and had a really interesting history of native people owning the land and then white people mysteriously stealing the land. This is recent. This isn't 400 years ago or something. I think it was about 80 years ago. There are records. Well, that local city hall, they shouldn't just be in a position of kind of questioning local people who are going to have strong economic incentives. Who'll come in and say, my grandfather owned this land and he didn't steal it from any native people, and they're going to give you their totally biased perspective. Even for something like this that may be local history, you need to have some capacity to reach out to the National Archives or some National Research Institute and say, look, we need somebody with a PhD to go to the archives and establish how was the land claim negotiated? How were these boundaries drawn up? What's the real order? We have some records here at City Hall, but there are complaints from different quarters. We don't know what to do about it. We need some kind of fact-finding mission. We need some kind of investigation. So again, I don't think I've ever read a constitution of any country that set down research as a crucial part of government. But in all these ways and more, research, establishing the facts, whether you call it a commission of inquiry or what have you. It really is one of the most important functions of government. And in this way, it has to be, to some extent, centralized. So that's the lesson I come to. And I'll be honest with you guys, I already came to that conclusion 1998, 1999. This is one of my first breakthroughs in political science. And I came to it because I was a very harsh critic of everything that was going on in communism and socialism on the far left. They have their whole crazy discourse about centralization. And then I was also a critic of what was going on in neoliberalism on the far right. And at that time, they were really glamorizing decentralization in a very irresponsible way, where to them, decentralization was an excuse to not provide education to the poor and this kind of thing. It was like, well, you don't want the central government controlling education and so on. Oh, and the reality is this is just going to mean rich people sending their kids to private school and this kind of thing. Whereas this really, dishonest use of decentralization to justify various sort of right-wing agendas and privatization in general. Kind of besmirching the public sector and nonprofit sector and what have you. What you see in an example like Athens, ancient Athens, thousands of years ago, is a society that had created the most fundamental mechanism of the centralized state, which is centralized taxation. So they had money, in one storehouse, so to speak. And if you read Constitution of Athens by Aristotle, they were very fastidious about who was literally guarding the money day by day, who was responsible. They were very, very worried about corruption and theft from the public purse. And then they had everyone in the city come together and decide how they were going to spend the money. And both the supporters and critics, it's interesting, they all point out they were very libertine. They had festival after festival and holiday after holidays, in peacetime at least. They built public baths so that poor people, but the rich had their own ways of bathing apparently, but the poor especially appreciate having a place to shower and swim and sauna or whatever they did in these baths. I don't really know, but bathhouses and things like the Olympic Games and festivals and things, they did actually spend this money in a kind of profligate or joyous way. This is partly recorded. So we have a positive example in some ways, but what Athens utterly lacked was a concept of having decentralized decision-making and centralized enforcement, implementation, etc. And thus their political system became absurd and even tyrannical when it simply was expanded beyond downtown Athens, when it was expanded beyond the walls of the agora. Their relationships to even their immediate neighbors. Athens did briefly grow into an empire. They were as despicable and hated as any kingdom or any tyranny when they ran their empire. It was all the same to the conquered people, because you still had the same group of people in one marketplace. Right here, we're here in Athens, right here at the Pnyx, making decisions for far-flung cities and so on and so forth. They didn't recognize those other cities as making these decisions, and they didn't recognize their government as in this way being a kind of servant of having whether you think of it as bureaucratic implementation, enforcement, because indeed this includes law enforcement. I mean, there's no greater evil than having a corrupt police department. And this is still a huge problem throughout the United States of America. It's a problem in various parts of Europe to various extents. You don't want the local policeman to be a guy you went to high school with. You might think you do. Now actually pause to think about the actual people you went to high school with. You might think it would be great to walk into the police station, but, oh yeah, Biff, I remember you from high school. Okay, what if you slept with Biff's girlfriend? What if Biff slept with your girlfriend? What if Biff beat you up after the football game that time? The level of corruption, of them taking bribes, them being married to your sister, family entanglements, and so on. What you'd much rather have is, in a sense, a professional, centralized, distant, and remote enforcement of the law, but where your role is to go down to the parliament, go down to the Pnyx, participate in deciding on what the laws should be, and then you centralize how those laws are implemented, enforced, and so on.